distant skies, firefight calls, the stakes are high. Turn the flame, heroes and spies, control fire, where strategy lies. Hear the tales, fierce and deep, victors roar, defeated weep. We blaze a way, we don't hold back, control fire, ready to attack.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Fire, your monthly musings on Mantic's Firefight. I'm Sam.
Mike.
I'm Luke.
I'm Richard.
And I'm Matt.
So you may have heard some additional voices in our normal introduction. That's because this month we are joined by Matt and Richard from the Rules Committee. We're going to be chatting a bunch of new things in the pipeline, chatting through the design process as we've seen a lot of new units be released to the Vault, and all things good that we have from the RC. We are big fans of their work, as we've mentioned many times on the show before. Welcome, Matt and Richard. It's lovely to have you.
It's good to be here.
Thank you very much.
It's about now that we do From the Forge. I think everyone's probably sick of hearing from Mike, Luke, and myself exactly how slow our hobby tables progress. Matt, did you want to chat through what's on your hobby table at the moment?
Trees at the moment. And scenery. Recently bought a few of the new Mantic gaming mats, and one of them is a sort of dark volcanic kind of world. And we were setting up for a tournament, and I realised that I couldn't just put my lovely green trees and idyllic little houses for Kings of War or things on it at the moment, ready for a tournament in a couple of weeks. I'm furiously trying to make trees and hills and things that would work on a volcanic table, dead burnt out trees and that kind of thing. Not sure what uses obstacles yet, but I'm sure I'll think of something.
That's so interesting, because I know when Terrain Crate 3 was being launched, Ronnie was saying that some of their best sellers were those scraggly, clawing-looking trees, that those from their existing Terrain Crate range seem to be outselling a lot of the other things from the Terrain Crate. People just wanted those kind of trees that weren't so green and lush, and so that's why the alien trees came through to Terrain Crate. So you're working on those sort of clawy, scrabbly ones?
Yeah, obviously we run Kings of War tournaments and Firefight tournaments, so there's quite a lot of crossover in the terrain that we use, and I tend to have forests, perhaps more than other people do, in my Firefight games. It makes a nice volcanic Mustafar type world, but it's just very flat. I needed things to put on it other than just, let's just put a few buildings there, and dead burnt out trees and volcanic flats looked interesting. That's my current thing, seeing what I can do with some spray cans, because I'm too lazy to paint them by hand.
Awesome. Yeah, I always need to be spending more time painting terrain. I've mentioned before just how difficult I find it, because it's just so much less exciting than painting new units, of which we've seen a lot come through recently.
Very true.
Richard, what's on your hobby table?
At the moment, I've got a bunch of rockers I'm painting up, while some marauders sit looking accusingly from a pile of half-finished bits as well. So, but I kind of wanted to paint some of these guys up. I was wanting to try and do a bit of a deserty kind of theme with them, a bit kind of 8th Army World War II kind of sandy khaki and so forth. It's coming out okay so far, but we're still working on it a bit. But just something for a little bit different, and whether I get these guys up to the point of using them in Firefight or whether they'll end up as a bit of a little dead zone force, I don't know yet, but we'll see. But I feel like for Firefight, they don't see as much love as I would have expected, because Brockers are one of my favourite unit in the army. So that's currently what I'm busy painting up.
And I know that Brockers are also one of Mike's favourite units for the Forge Fathers as well.
Yes, I normally rotate between them and the Thagaran for the same problem, I guess. So.
We do see a lot of Brockers around here, quite a few. Most Forge Fathers play with one or two units of them.
Right. Yep. Interestingly, in the UK, we've tended not to see too many of them by comparison. It tends to be a real focus on Rekir and Thorgrim normally for the infantry.
Yeah, I do love seeing them because they die first, which is great.
For the cheaper stuff, we tend to see people taking militia, actually. I don't know if that's just models that they've got available and stuff. But yeah, I quite like the little Brocker models. For one of the old PVC ranges, they're actually pretty nice little models.
I've actually got a unit of militia at the moment. I'm building it. That's what's literally on my hobby table right in this moment is a whole bunch of militia that I'm building and starting to undercoat.
Nice.
The actual militia models with the cloaks, or
Yep.
are you using Steel Warriors?
No, using the actual proper militia blocks,
good.
the old ones. So yeah, with the cloaks and stuff. So it's all different. I've got a unit of 10 already, and there's 20 in a box. I don't know what I'm going to do with 30 of them, but we'll see.
Before we jump into discussing what we might be seeing in the future of Firefight, should we have a bit of a discussion just on your backgrounds in gaming? Are you able to give us the elevator pitch? What What's your background in the hobby? How do you find yourself in Firefight, and how did you land yourself a job on the Rules Committee?
My background in gaming, I think like a lot of people of my age, I started off playing Heroes Quest and Space Crusade, board games from MB back in the day. And I can remember one of them came with some sort of little leaflet in it, or you sent off for it, I think, and it was a leaflet with all the models. I remember standing outside a science lesson with my friends, all kind of looking at this little book, going, oh, isn't this amazing? This looks really quite good. I think from that we went to Warhammer, and then from Warhammer to Warhammer 40,000. And then I got a bit older, stopped playing through university because I thought I was cooler than I really was. And then I think after university, there is a day that sort of lives in infamy. My wife absolutely regrets it, where I went to her and said, do you think I'd be a bit nerdy if I started painting some of these little toy soldiers? And she regrets this. She said, no, that's fine. And now she just wishes she'd just gone, don't do it. Because now we've got a shed full of the stuff, a loft full of the stuff, cupboards full of the stuff. Yeah. And then from that, we did other game systems, Saga and a few other things. Ended up doing Kings of War Historical. I think I'm one of the few people ever to get into Kings of War via Historical. And then from that, I saw a thing online about doing some beta testing for Firefight, played some games, sent our responses in to Mantic, and then got the response, yeah, we stopped taking that ages ago. We've had a closed beta for the last few months. You've been playing on old rules. And we're like, oh, okay, that's a shame. But that got us talking to them. We ran some tournaments. I ended up as a play tester. And then after a couple of months being a play tester, they said, do you want to join the RC? And I thought, that sounds cool. So I did.
I like how in your story you referred to, we have these models. That was nice.
Yeah. Hasn't taken over the house at all.
It's owned in the collective. I love your sliding doors moment in there as well. Like, it could have gone off on this one particular path, but no, this is the path that has been taken, and it's led to a shed.
Yeah, and she regrets it every day, but she can't stop now.
Richard, what's your background in the hobby?
I've been playing. I mean, obviously, I did all the stuff as a teenager with the Hero Quest, Space Crusade, Man of War, stuff like that. I've been playing reasonably competitively since probably for just over 25 years now, in everything from Warhammer to War Machine, Epic Armageddon, Saga, Malifaux. Basically, I played most of the war games out there at some point. I tend to be fairly competitive. Apart from anything else, it's the only way I generally get things painted. Otherwise, I'm really slow to paint. But if I've got a deadline there for an event, because I refuse to put unpainted models on the table for a tournament, it's just no, not doing that. So I played competitive quite a long time. I'd never actually did any technically play testing for Firefight beforehand. I have done it before for Kings of War. I effectively ended up on the RC because Matt asked me to. And so at that point, I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. I can help out on that. And then ended up with an incredibly intense 3 months or whatever while we were knocking out command protocols.
You'd done a fair bit of play. You've been play testing with Matt G.
Oh, that's true. Okay, fair. Yeah.
And you'd sort of reached a point where you were the play testers that were giving us the most feedback quickest.
I'd completely forgotten about that, to be honest.
Yeah. No, you did. You definitely. And then it got to the point where we realised that, we needed another rules committee member. And again, you tend to look towards the play testers who have been the most active and that have given the most responses. And then
Matt said no.
And Matt said no. And we got you.
Yeah, fair. Out of the rules committee, I'm probably the one that's most likely to hopefully find all the busted and broken stuff and try and tamp it down before it gets released. It's not been, the amount of stuff we had to do through command protocols was significant, but most of the really nasty stuff got stripped out from the original version. I think there's still some bits in there, but the scale of variance is now a lot lower than it was before. Games get past round 3 for starters. That's a positive.
Yeah, all my games used to end on turn 2, and then now we're at least getting to 3. It's great.
You'd been tabled by turn 2, Luke? That's terrible.
I've never been tabled, Sam.
I should have mentioned at the start of the episode, we're 1 year old this month. It was in May 2024 that we had our first episode of Controlled Fire. So this is our 1 year birthday, and our first episode of Controlled Fire, of course, was unpacking command protocols and breaking down all the great things that it had done for the game. And so much of it is, as you say, the game's run on longer, but also the tightness that it's now brought to the list building, where all those support choices have to fight for their slots. All the great things that we unpacked in our first episode. So it's wonderful to look back on that and actually chat with the people responsible for making it happen. happen.
What we can't forget is there were other Rules Committee members that were very active during the run-up to Command Protocol. So what Richard and I, and then Kyle towards the end, ended up doing a lot of was the taking all the ideas that the previous chair of the Rules Committee and a few other Rules Committee members had got. And we basically ended up with we need to get this into one document now, because obviously things sort of live as always multiple things, multiple ideas, multiple documents. That, very intense time that Richard talked about was taking all these ideas that weren't necessarily ours. They were, previous Rule Committee members. And then we just had to go through them and kind of go, right, we've got time for that. We haven't got time for that. Maybe we don't want to do that one, but we really like that thing. And I don't want to forget those chats because they put a lot of work in as well.
I mean, you can certainly thank previous RC chair for the significant changes with enforcers, for instance. He was very much a proponent of getting them to 2 wounds and being a bit tankier, because before they were pretty much just slightly upgraded Marines more than anything else, really. They weren't that different from a Ranger or something like that. So I think initially it was supposed to be quite a small set of changes, and it kind of grew and grew and grew till it almost became like a 1.5 for the game. The scope extended quite significantly from the original brief. Thankfully, we've not gone quite so far with alignment protocols. But
I'm very keen to discuss alignment protocols. Before we run on, of course, there is a third member of the Rules Committee who isn't able to join today because they have another commitment. But Kyle has passed on a little bit of his background. Luke, did you want to read on Kyle's behalf?
Yeah, sure. So Kyle says, I've always loved model making and got my first miniature war game, MechWarrior Dark Age, around age 12, and I haven't looked back since. I started out as a playtester for Kings of War, and I forget if I was asked personally or answered an open call to become a Firefight playtester. I made the Firefight table mod on Tabletop Simulator, and I did a podcast episode or 2 on Countercharge about Firefight, so maybe that was the impetus for being invited to be a playtester. I played the original version of Firefight, but I really enjoyed the second edition rules when they came out, and was excited to be part of the game and continue to involve the game. After being a beta tester for a while, I was asked to be an alpha tester, and eventually when a spot opened up on the RC, I was asked to join. The first thing that I worked on as an RC member was the Night Stalkers.
Which have been such a great addition to the game. I faced Mike's Night Stalkers in the most recent tourney that we played. So that was a very tight and enjoyable game.
I don't remember the scoreline being close, but anyway.
Right, I do remember the devastation wrought by your mind screechers on my plague.
Now imagine if they weren't nerfed. I was in the beta chat a lot saying, these are really, really good. Spam mind screechers, that's the meta. Spam mind screechers, so they got nerfed.
They are still good, but of course at 90 points a model, they certainly are an investment if you are looking to take them. And Mike took 5.
The only reason I took 5 is because I have separate bases for Kings of War, so I actually had to adapt the bases from Kings of War to Firefight as well, and do it for the extra 250 points because I didn't have anything else on hand to make the other 250 up. I wasn't supposed to be playing, but there was an uneven number, so I jumped in. So it was a last minute tune up to take 5.
I will say we did get a lot of passers-by stopping and looking at your army because, of course, 5 floating brains with tentacles hovering around a board is pretty eye-catching. It drew some great attention.
I was always concerned originally that I thought Night Stalkers and Plague were too similar, but again, playing against each other pointed out the differences between the way those 2 armies played. So again, it goes kudos to the Rules Committee on making the Night Stalkers different to Plague, even though this similar type of identity of being an assaultish type army.
Yeah, it's really interesting. They are 2 horde generally based, assault generally focused, but they play markedly differently. And particularly in the list building where the Night Stalkers have thumbs aplenty and the Plague are hunting down the back of the couch for any thumbs they can find. I know we've just been chatting about the creation of command protocols and the things that it's been bringing to the game. As an RC, what's your view of the current state of the Firefight rules and balance across the factions?
What we've had now is time. There's been time to get people's opinions. There's been time to get tournaments and feedback, and then you start to realise that there's always going to be little things that you need to tweak, and there are some things that were quite drastically needed to be tweaked, but not too many of them, I hope. It was one of those things where we started and we thought, we'll just change this one thing, or just change this 2 thing, and then you start listening to play testers, and they come to you with these nice lists as long as your arm, and you have to kind of say, okay, let's bring it down a little bit. And it's grown. Thankfully, we've been chatting with Clive at Mantic, and he's given us space to make the changes that we think would improve the game and to tweak the army list. The companion gives us that ability to make changes more quickly than if we were restricted by printed media. There's stuff to do, but hopefully by the summer we should be one step closer to an even more balanced game.
For me, it's not in a bad state at the moment. I think quite heartening is that when you look at, for example, on a competitive side of things, it's not just a case of one army is just there at the top all the time, which is always concerning if you just see one army that just dominates. The faction we're probably looking at giving the most TLC to probably is the Enforcers, because they have been struggling a bit. When we came around to doing command protocols, firstly, they had some of the biggest changes to the list, but also they were one of the armies that probably had to get toned down the most, or had changed a lot in terms of some of the unpleasant stuff they could do with Firestorm, for instance, which was pretty, yeah, I mean, it was a thing. Firestorm and a couple of the bombers, for example, really could just make for a bit of an oppressive sort of situation within the game. There is certain bits where we're just trying to kind of find a nice balance for them. Because obviously we don't want any army being oppressively powerful, but we don't want an army where people feel that they can't be competitive with, and especially where they can't be competitive without trying to just spam things. Because most of the armies in the game, the general idea is to try and make it so that the best army is one where you have a good variety of units, where you have lots of tools in your toolbox to make the game fun. Cookie cutter and spam armies are boring. And so what we want is to make sure that you can field a bit of this and a bit of that, and it will be effective within the game. I think for me, the only part where I think it would be great to see some refining with is probably some of the terrain rules. But realistically, at the moment, that's probably going to be another full edition of Firefight before we can put in too many significant changes on that. Mainly, it's the perennial problem of things like buildings and stuff. Other than that, though, I think we're in a reasonable spot. And I think alignment protocols will just help tweak some of that internal balance. And again, it tends to be internal balance within the lists. So expect to see a bit of love for things like Hornets, for instance. At the moment, they have been basically, I would imagine, sitting at the bottom of everyone's toy box and generally not seeing much time on a table, which is a shame because they're a really cool model.
I have a assembled and unprimed Hornet that I have had since the very first box of Firefight that I bought. It's funny you mentioned the faction balance competitively, because I've noticed in our local chat, every time there's a new tournament somewhere in the world, someone will post and say, interesting that this faction won. And the comment's always, yes, but look at the name of the player, right? That's the important thing here. So just like Kings of War, a good player can win with any faction.
Yeah, pretty much.
Except the Forces.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't tried, in fairness, as yet. I think it was the last tournament or the one prior that Matt had run. We had a new player who turned up within Forces, and I mean, he was playing me on top table on the last game, so he had a fair shot at it.
I think the issue there was the list he ended up having to take was very, very specific. I think, we put a lot of work into Enforcers, probably more than any other faction for this update, just to give you that variety. Because I think a lot of people were just getting into that rut where it was, well, I have to take a bomber, I have to take heavy support missile launchers, I have to take peacekeepers. As my troops, peacekeepers and peacekeepers. And what we want is so you can take peacekeepers, but that if you take operatives, you don't feel like you've shot yourself in the foot. Because it's entirely possible. I could take the best army in the world and I could go up against Richard and he would absolutely destroy me. But that's because Richard's commanding the army. We want to be in a world where if you're playing somebody of a reasonably similar skill level to you, you can take more than one possible list and still have a chance and still have fun. So I think what Luke was saying is very right. Winners of tournaments tend to be the people that are best at the game, and that's kind of what it's supposed to be. You don't want a world where you kind of go, there's this unbeatable list that you found on the internet, which if you take, nobody can beat you. That's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, we don't want Warhammer 7th edition, that's for sure.
Kind of glad to hear, Matt, that you playing Richard is similar to me trying to play Luke or Sam. It's like I generally get destroyed when I play those two gentlemen. So gentlemen might be a bit rich, but anyway.
It is interesting because often people will raise the subject of things like tier lists of factions, saying this faction is A tier, this faction is B tier, but I've never really seen that applying so strongly to Firefight. I think there's basically everyone's roughly on the same tier, except Enforcers, who are kind of one step down at the moment. A short step, but when everything else is so level, it's just a bit more noticeable.
I think you could possibly do something like that if you broke down each faction into its archetypes and then ranked those perhaps, but still you'd end up with a lot of things sitting on the same levels. And it would be an assault-focused army is going to be roughly equivalent to an assault-focused army of another army that does assault well. So yeah, I agree. It would be impossible to generate a tier list for this.
Richard, I was so pleased to hear you say that it's baked into the design philosophy, the idea that we're actually wanting to see a variety of units appearing, and then that is the ideal list rather than spam. Because I 100% agree. I love having a nice, diverse array of tools. I love to hear that the idea of variety is baked in the design.
If anything, the trickiest part we've probably had or been finding in terms of the design process is actually balancing ranged to assault. There is nothing quite as depressing as playing a game against the sort of classic, I don't know if you've heard the term leaf blower lists. It was used quite a lot in the UK for Imperial Guard armies in 40k back in the day, where you would just basically delete your opponent in turn and a half. The opponent would just be taking the models off and that was it. You didn't really engage with it. On the flip side, pre-command protocols firefight, close combat was really good, especially because there were no downsides to, for example, just charging out of a vehicle. So we saw a heavy emphasis on things like Marauder Brawlers in transports. Yeah, I can see some sheepish looks there. Where you just run across, just rampage, and there was nothing in the game to stop that at all. And one of the worst things, generally, I find in any war game is when you have no counterplay, where there's nothing. It's not a case of if you play really skilled, you can get around with this or do that. It's just like your opponent just goes, right, I have this win button, I'm going to press it, and shoom, there we go. Provided the dice aren't catastrophically bad, there's nothing you can do about it. And so trying to move that away from that, where if you can still do that kind of thing, but there is negatives to it. So it softens it up. If brawlers go and charge out of a mule, you're still probably going to win the combat if you get to charge without them being able to react to it. But the addition of things like Overwatch to try and start protecting against that, the negatives to hit if you're charging out of a vehicle, you can't just go into, say, for example, a 15-man unit of GCPS Marines and just literally with 6 brawlers just go, right, you're all dead. You'll still kill probably 5 or 6 of them at least, or unit will be pushed back and so forth, but you're not just going in and just deleting everything. And trying to balance that so that you don't end up in a situation where one army just steamrolls the other off the table because at the moment assault is better than firefight. It's a really careful balancing act, especially in a game where we've got a couple of factions at least which have a very strong emphasis towards close combat and at least a couple with quite a strong emphasis towards firing with enforced and GCPS. And that, if anything, is probably the bit that we spend most time debating in terms of how to do it.
Going on from also kind of what you said, but also what Sam was saying about trying to give people the option to have variety. You don't want to be in a situation where people can't literally afford to put the army on the table because the unit that they have to have, because it's the only one that works, happens to be a very, very expensive unit. We're in this interesting position as a rules committee where we don't work for Mantic, we work with Mantic and under Mantic's supervision, and everything goes through them. But they have never, hand on heart, they've never come to us and said, I want to sell more of this. Can you make this really good? Or I don't want to sell these. Can you make them bad? There is something in our mind where we're looking at units where we're kind of going, this is going to be easy for people to get hold of. It's a plastic sprue. So we want people to be able to use them. We want a variety of units that come out of this. We do have a mind towards, we'll make this unit a minimum of 3 models because that's what comes on the sprue, or a maximum of 10 because that's multiples of the sprue. But it's not a sales thing, because that to the RC, that doesn't really mean much to us. But as players thinking, how do we make this army accessible? How do we make it so that somebody can build the list that they really want to do and then go out and get it?
It's a nice thing that the core of the game should be plastic sprues, and that's actually of benefit to both Mantic, who sell the plastic sprues, and the players, who the most common way to gain lots of models for their army is plastic sprues. I think that's actually a really nice synergy between caring more about the rules of the units and caring about selling models, because there's that core that sort of I guess both groups are aiming to utilize heavily. I am guilty, Richard. I do have 4 mules and 3 units of skyscrapers from previous edition.
How many hulks do you have?
6.
Yeah, I thought so.
It was basically brawlers and mules, skyscrapers and hulks. was the army.
Because the mules used to unlock the skyscrapers and the hulks, right? Because mules also used to be an unlocking unit.
There was a reason I pushed for the auxiliary rule, so that you didn't get penalised for taking the transports, but you couldn't just use them to unlock everything, because that was problematic.
Yes, that was a great idea. And also, yes, enforcers were a leaf blower army. Can confirm. And they are well tempered now.
Mike, do you want to read out the statement from Kyle on the view of command protocols?
Kyle says, or I should say, I think command protocols was a great addition to the game that solved some inherent rules problems that propped up after the public release and added more distinction to the factions. The current edition was made during COVID, with almost all playtest games happening online using Universal Battles 2. Because of that environment, there were edge cases where things that popped up that required significant update to correct. While the bones of the original rulebook are absolutely excellent, the Command Protocols book put the game in a very good state for a general play. With the factions getting a bit more flavour in the Command Protocols, I think we're in a good spot overall. That doesn't mean that everything is perfect, but for new people coming into the game, all factions are viable and there aren't any glaring or game-breaking rules that would drive them away. Well, hopefully. For our veteran players, there's been a stream of content to keep them engaged between a whole new faction, a major Starian rework, and the Vault units have been added to the other factions, plus this upcoming update, which has lots of great stuff. Yeah, I mean, the one thing I loved about, and I still love about Command Protocols, and I was playing with a new gentleman yesterday, is just how different each different faction feels and plays. I mentioned before how Night Stalkers and Plague are different, but all the different factions. I think that's the best thing that came out of Command Protocols is how all the different factions all feel very different on the table, and they all had their unique flavor when you're playing them on the table. And I think that was an awesome job, doing Command Protocols.
Well, it was great that Kyle called out the new Vault exclusive units that we've seen start to arrive. So this kind of started with the Marauder Salvage Engineers. We started the rules come through, and then last month, very excited, we'd see 4 new units drop for the Astarians. And before I can get over my excitement for that, we have 3 new units arrive for the Plague. Obviously, this is a very exciting time for Firefight. Are we able to pick your brain on what your design process is for these new units? Are you able to walk us through the design process? We say pick the Marauder Salvage Engineers as the first ones, and how you go about designing a fresh unit for the game.
Recently, we started working a lot closer with Clive. In previous years, our main contact at Mantic was Matt Gilbert. Since sort of last summer, we talked quite closely with Clive. Obviously, he's running the Vault. He's got a lot of impact there. I think there was a thing a little while back where he was releasing a lot of units, what they called for Dead Zone teams, those very specific teams that were preset. And they went down quite well, and he had all these units. And he sort of approached us and said, well, we've got these things. Can we start giving some of these things rules for Firefight? And we thought it was a brilliant idea, because you want a game to have a certain amount of new content, a certain flow of new content. But Firefight's not the biggest game. We're not as big as Kings of War. And without the Vault, it might be a little while between new things, and it allows us to sort of trickle things in at a rate we couldn't do otherwise. So he will come to us and say, I've got these new models, I've got these new ideas for miniatures. And for the first run round, it was pretty much, I've got these things, can you please make rules for them? And he would go to us, and he would go to the Dead Zone Rules Committee, and then they'd go and make theirs, and we'd go and make ours, and then we'd compare them, and we'd kind of go, oh, actually, we need to change that because ours is so massively different to yours, it's not going to look right. And that was kind of worked for the first run round. By the time we got to the last one, by the time we got to the Plague, and to a lesser extent the Assyrian ones as well, we'd been working with Clive on them long enough that Clive was able to say, this is coming up, what sort of things might you like to use? So we kind of went to him and said, well, we're looking at the Plague, and you've got a plastic sprue there, which is nice and accessible for people to get hold of. You can get hold of ghouls. But in this game, they only make 1 unit. And if you look at Enforcers, you can pick up a plastic Enforcer operative sprue, and it can be Breach and Eradicate. It can be Defenders if you put a shield on them. It can be the Missile Launcher Heavy Support Unit. That one sprue did a lot of work, and the ghouls weren't doing that. So we said, could you do something for us that would make ghouls have a bit of variety? And he said, I'd quite like to give them shields. And we're like, yeah, that sounds really interesting. And then there was something that he really wanted. So he really wanted to buy because he thought they'd look cool. So we said, okay, we'll take them. We'll go for that. And then he came up with some grenades, and we thought, well, we've done grenades recently with the Salvage Engineers, so we can do something with that. And the Dead Zone Committee were a bit quicker than us, and they came back with some of the things that they would use for those models. So they came up with the names basically and some of the stats, and then we have that kind of little back and forth process where we kind of go, okay, I can see what Dead Zone are doing with them. It is a different game. We don't have to copy what Dead Zone does stat for stat, but you have to make it so that they're kind of similar. Otherwise, it'd be really weird. Yeah, and that's just that sort of process. So we're now at a point where we're talking to Clive, and Clive's, it's a little bit of a, what do Mantic want to release? What does Clive want to release? What would look cool? And a little bit of us saying, well, actually, if we look at these lists, where are there gaps that we'd like to fill? Where are there things that we would like to use more? And I think it's good.
Yeah, it's always a tricky balancing act with stuff because, say, for example, Plague, it's obviously really good to get good use out of plastic sprue. On the flip side, it's always a tricky one if you've got a faction like Plague and the sort of direction that things are going in is, for example, more close combat. We have quite a lot of that already. What we could do is just a few more guns maybe, but it is what it is. Again, as Matt says, it's just great sometimes just to get a gentle flow of new models and so forth coming out, just so it doesn't feel like the game's been stuck on the back burner by Mantic and forgotten about. Everyone quite likes a new little toy to play with now and then in a faction, especially if it opens up a different bit of opportunity for play and how the faction might work and synergies and so forth. It's a tricky one. And the other thing, of course, that we've got to balance on the other side is the factions at the moment are quite distinct between them all. One of the risks as you build the factions up in size, other than it becoming issues of balance potentially, is also that issue of every faction kind of doing everything, and then nothing feels very special anymore. So that's the other sort of balancing act with it. Sometimes it's that sort of thing of, be careful what you wish for a little bit. Everyone wants more stuff for their faction, but you can end up in a situation where, again, they're all functionally the same and they all have all the same stuff. So, who knows? Eventually we may even do bits where we'd sort of attempted it with Blaine, I think, last year, where it was a bit of a sort of limited time sort of thing with it. Whether or not we end up with some bits that are just there for a limited time or something, we'll have to see. Or whether we just keep on packing them out a little bit more. Obviously, it would be nice at some point to be able to match the same factions that they have in Dead Zone. I think that's going to be much more long-term for some of that stuff, especially the fish guys.
Interesting that there's that inherent way to force the RCs to get on with it, because the first one to release the rules gets gets somewhat of their say in terms of how the unit functions. So playing you off against each other is quite a good move, I think.
I just wanted to ask Sam, how much do you pay Clive, or do you have incriminating photos for him to do your three factions first?
Well, I haven't had anything for Maison yet, but no, I will say I've been incredibly lucky in that, as you say, Mike, 3 of my factions are the ones to have received the new units. Though I do note, of course, there was a new unit drop for Forge Fathers, I think the Repair Crew, which hasn't seen rules in either Dead Zone or Firefight. So, Mike, maybe you're just missing out.
Yeah, well, what can I say?
When you look back through the Vault back catalogue, there are things that we could go back to do. I think what Clive wants to keep on doing is keep it exciting and new. And if we just went back and was already in the Vault, you wouldn't get that kind of excitement. But that doesn't mean that when you're doing something new and then you look back in the Vault and you go, oh, hang on a minute, there was a unit there that we could use. If it gets to the point where Clive said to us, I want to do some Veermin stuff, and then you look back and you go, there's Vault Chasers, maybe at one point we could go back and we could do rules for those. But you would probably wait until a point where Clive also had something new to do for Veermin, because you want something new in there as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Keep it new and fresh. I was going to say, Richard, in regard to trying to find the variety in Plague Assault, I 100% understand, because obviously you've got just on the 40 mil assault units in play, you've got the Murder Birds, the Plague Swarms, the Leapers, and the Terratons, all entirely assault focused, same base, they all just with slightly different rules and different nuances to it. But with the new ghouls as they've come through, it's actually filled a gap which I'd always wanted to have, which is ghouls in mules. So I've always wanted to be able to run ghouls in mules, but of course with the very large drop cost pushing players to run ghoul hordes, which is very sensible, it means you always feel bad putting regular ghouls in mules because you'd be paying 81 points in order to put that 6-strong unit in there for not really much impact. But with these new units, which are a little bit more specialized and more expensive, it means you're not blowing out all the force selection and the troop unlocks in order to put them in there. I finally got my ghouls in mules. I'm very excited. So I might just quickly read out Kyle's response to the design of the salvage engineers. So for him, I really try to have the models and lore behind them dictate the initial rules for them. Then I look at the faction as a whole and see what role they can fit into that the faction would be beneficial and wouldn't invalidate other units in the faction. For the salvage engineers specifically, I saw an opportunity for a troop unit that played a bit more of a hybrid role compared to the commandos and brawlers that has some effective short-range shooting and charge reactions that would help them hold objectives. So they work great in a mule and can act as a mobile problem solver as well. 100% agree. And I think it's testament to the strength of their design that I think most Marauder armies I've seen recently are running one unit, but only one, in that they have utility, but not spam ability, which I think is great.
Yeah, and my experience with them at tournaments has been run one, generally in a mule, and they are perfectly balanced as far as I can tell in every way. I think it's probably one of the most perfect designs that's come out in a little while.
Good play testers, isn't it? Found all the rough edges for us.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things we do to be mindful of when we're adding new units as well is actually the overall army composition in terms of things like the number of troop units, specialists and things like that. One of the really nice things for Marauders, for instance, with salvage engineers, other than the fact they are a really useful unit, is that it adds another troop choice so that you're not just relying on mainly brawlers and commandos, because more beasts, they're okay, but again, as Sam sort of commented before, no thumbs, which is a problem. And that is probably, in terms of other things that at some point we might address, is what I call the beast issue, because it does have some implications where, again, if you can take one unit that has thumbs and one that doesn't, competitive minded players are going to go the one that can score everything, because winning games is all about being able to contest and take objectives at the end of the day. Padding out things like troop choices so that you don't have a faction where it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to take a load of commandos or a load of brawlers, and that's it. It's nice having that chance to pad it out a bit. And the same applies with Plague more than anything else with that as well. Getting a few more interesting troop options with a bit more interest, but all viable in different roles and so forth as well, just makes it a bit more interesting at that point.
You can now play almost like a corrupted play GCPS army, because you've got that bloke who looks like a riot trooper, and you've got the blokes that look like corrupted marines. So you can go to that theme now. You can say, well, I'm going to go for the ghoul heavy. It looks like this GCPS regiment just caught the plague and now they've all gone gribbly. Just give you another option.
I love that idea, because you'd run a 3A lieutenant and a 3A general as your commanders, ghouls, bruisers, and crushers as your troops. You'd have 3A weapon teams as your specialists, and you've got all the GCPS vehicles in your support. Love that idea.
Man, take a Hornet.
So we've heard the phrase alignment protocols seeded liberally throughout this conversation. I've seen a little bit of occasional chatter about it. What are alignment protocols, and what should Firefight players expect to see from this?
We ended up, in discussions with Clive and with other people at Mantic, and we realised that there were going to be some changes that we needed to do, some balance changes. It had been a year or so since command protocols. As you can see from what Kings of War has done recently, the companion gives you this opportunity to make those changes and release those new things. So alignment protocols is kind of like the name that we've been using when we've been discussing it with ourselves and we discuss it with the play testers. And what we're likely to get is a companion-focused digital release that allows us to tweak the units that we think need tweaking, trying to limit the changes to core rules. I think there's like one core rule we might talk about in a minute that really needed changing, and we might consider the odd extra mission scenario or something. But on the whole, it's going through each of the factions and saying which units we're not seeing, which units we're seeing too much of, which units to Luke take, in which case it probably needs nerfing. And
that's fair.
Yeah. And I think that, the Hornets come up a few times and you look at it and go, well, perhaps we need to do something about some of those flying units, and the Hornet in particular. If a unit's so bad somebody makes a April Fool's Day joke about it, then it probably needs addressing. Don't expect the size and the impact on the actual core rules that command protocols had. This is more of your yearly balance changes to factions. But if there's one or two keywords that might need a little bit of tweaking, Clive and Mantic are happy for us to do those, because what they want at the end of the day is the best version of the game that they can have without making it so different that we alienate people who would end up thinking it's a different game. So that's the plan.
If we align command protocols being like Kings of War's big red book, then alignment protocols might be thought of more as like the annual clash.
Yeah, that kind of
smaller scale.
Yeah, I think we're balancing. The more we go through the factions, the more you realise that there are lots of things you want to balance. And what you don't want to do is miss things out which you think could be better. But whereas Clash of Kings books tended to be the book with balance changes, but then there's often something else at the beginning of it, isn't there? There's something like one year it had siege rules and those sorts of things. This is more, and our incredibly clever wording we're using, alignment. It is just bringing a few things into a line, a few units that just felt like they were out on the peripheries. Either they were too powerful or they weren't powerful enough, they weren't being used, or they were only being used. Just bringing those ones in without perhaps the scale of other things that Clash of Kings would often add.
And so as an example, something like Marauder Commandos, this applies pretty much across the board to any weapon, any unit similarly, is that we've looked at changing it so that if you've got the option for 2 specialist weapons, you need to have a larger base squad size before you unlock the second weapon. And we're looking at trying to apply that pretty consistently above that, mainly to stop armies just spamming small units with heavy weapons where the heavy weapons are quite good.
When this comes out in the companion, is it going to come out in the beta format or almost straight live? We've had some discussion recently in the chats that we have here in Brisbane about how long the beta process would be, which I think would be interesting to hear the reasons why some of the things are in beta for a fair period of time in this side of the companion.
I think things that have been in beta for a long time, such as Night Stalkers, they're still beta, aren't they? Mm-hmm. This might be the opportunity to kind of bring them out of that. The more recent things that have gone into beta have been the units that have come in the vaults, and we want to take that tag off when we've had a little bit more exposure, a little bit more people playing them. Night Stalkers is that point where it's been out for quite a long time now, and we've given it a lot of the same thoughts that we've given these new units. In fact, I think because some things sort of slowly change and you have an idea and you apply it to one faction and then you think, oh, actually that idea would be really good for the other ones. So Night Stalkers already feels quite like what we're doing with the new factions because it's already had those ideas. It was quite a recent faction. So those will probably come off of beta. Things that have been around for a long time will come off beta. Whether this stuff comes in, the new stuff comes in with it, I don't know. That's entirely up to Clive or up to Mansig. So I'm not 100% sure how they're going to present this yet. At the moment, our job is just to get the changes that we suggest, present the to Mantic, at which point it becomes their commercial decision about how it actually makes it out to the public. And that one, I just honestly can't answer yet.
Given how fresh the Night Stalkers are and, dare I say, extremely well balanced, I'm hearing that we can't really expect many Night Stalkers changes in the upcoming release. They should stay fairly static.
Pretty much. There's a couple of small tweaks, and most of them are just quality of life things. So as a little example, the Astral Beam on Spectres gets targeting systems, and that's something we're generally trying to apply with a lot of the what I call the anti-tank heavy weapons that you can add to squads. You look at it and go, it's really quite miserable experience if you've bought a heavy weapon and you've got this unit of infantry in front of you and there's a tank over there, and you're like, okay, which am I going to actually do something about? And the idea that you then can't, that the heavy weapon wouldn't shoot the tank while the infantry gun down the infantry in front of them, is just like, that's what they would do realistically. So that's kind of what we're going to be able to allow them to do. So add a bit more flexibility and mean that it's not a penalty to take this heavy weapon, because it really shouldn't be.
That links to what we were saying about Blaze Away on some of the special weapons. You don't want a situation where in using one weapon, the other ones become pointless. So you don't want to target a unit with one anti-tank gun and a load of low-powered guns against a tank, because most of the blokes become pointless at that point. And we had a similar issue with blaze away weapons where you would blaze away and then the automatic weapon, like an autocannon or a heavy machine gun, then didn't shoot in that action. So doing something like giving blaze away to a heavy machine gun isn't a massive thing in the grand scheme of things, but it just means that you haven't got weird situations where everybody's blazing away with their guns and the bloke with the gun that's designed for doing large amounts of firepower has to stop for no apparent reason. And we've got this situation, we're not going to have lots of, Marines standing around doing nothing because they know they can't get through that armor 9 dwarf tank in front of them, while the one bloke with the fusion gun has a go at it.
That sounds particularly good for things like GCPS Ranger tank hunters, because their thermal rifle, of course, is designed for busting that tank. But those Rangers are shoot for marksmen with those carbines. They really do want to be shooting something that is not a tank.
And so Kyle has to say on this, this will be mostly a balance pass on all factions, but one rule change, and he thinks it's the only rule change that's going to happen that he's excited about, is units and weapons with the slow reload keyword are now able to benefit from steady aim action and remove a negative modifier. That's very spicy. I'm looking forward to that. And on the topic of balance, so he says, one thing that isn't obvious for most players is the amount of work that goes into making or changing something in the rules, is the amount of cross-checking that needs to be done to make sure that there aren't any strange rules interactions. The profile and the weapons are consistent with how everything else is written in all other profiles. It's reasonably balanced when compared to units within the faction and other factions and so on. We spend a lot of time doing what ifs and sending messages after a midnight epiphany, and we do appreciate that.
For me, I kind of sit on the forums where people keep comparing units across factions. I personally don't believe that should be a case. Different factions would fight different ways using different weapons.
Yeah, that kind of thing does, if anything, it forms a reference point when we're looking at things. Because if you've got, let's say, a guy with a rifle and he's a relatively similar profile to another guy with a rifle, they should be a relatively similar point. They might not necessarily be exactly the same. And of course, one thing that we did quite a bit with command protocols was that whole idea of front loading some of the points. So things like Marines, you are encouraged to take units of 10 to 15 rather than small units at the end of the day. And part of that is because, again, you don't necessarily want to just a complete MSU army all the time. The idea is using points to encourage people towards some chunkier units. And it actually means it's one of the big reasons as well why the game, other than toning down the orders, why the games last for a longer period as well, because bigger units are much, much harder to just pop like that. You actually have to work at it a bit, especially if people have been sensible and staying in terrain and all that kind of thing. There are other intangible factors that will go into how much something costs, which are a little bit harder to point for. Some of things like headstrong or some of the reactions they might have, and also just how they kind of fit in with the faction and how big they can get and stuff like that as well. So there's quite a few bits that might go into a final point. But yeah, we do look at comparable things so we can at least get a rough idea of where we want to start the discussion, if anything, on points. And we'll start it from there and then how we want to progress from that point.
Carl's point about rules interactions, it's things that you don't necessarily always see. So one of the first things obviously is an order. You design a unit that looks brilliant on paper, and then somebody will go, you do realise if they take that order, suddenly this unit that was fine becomes appalling and horrible. And then there's also how they interact with other rules. We've talked a few times about enforcers not being in the best place at the moment. I think it was because we were changing core rules and we were changing the stats of the enforcers. And we looked at an army that was a bit too powerful, and we had people that would put a heavy support unit and then give it the firestorm order, and it would just kill things over and over again. And we looked at that and went, there's some problems with orders there. Perhaps we need to introduce trademark weapons. Perhaps we need to stop people using the same order more than once. We had issues with people unlocking things with very, very cheap troop units, like, for example, enforcer engineers. So we introduced auxiliary units. At the same time, we're looking at the enforcers going, oh, maybe this unit's too good and this unit's too good, and increasing points and dropping ability. And what you ended up with a faction that got hit twice. It got hit with the nerfs to the unit, and it got hit with the changes to the rules that were taking away things that we didn't like, but that happened to have favoured the enforcers very, very strongly. And I think the plan of using this as mostly being changes to factions, not changes to the rules, means we shouldn't end up with too much of that. Oh my goodness, we just changed that core rule. We just made those 10 units that were really, really weak, really, really powerful. We didn't notice it. If the only major rule we're changing is steady aim, it gives you a smaller number of units, and you can basically look through it and go, right, actually, how many steady aim units have we actually got to worry about? It's a smaller number, and then we can check those.
And this is also one of the problems when you're trying to do a lot of changes in one go, is that if you don't nail down all of your core rules before you start on your army balancing, you can be in a position where, again, you either double nerf them or something, just you sort of got something in a reasonable place, then you change a core rule that will massively impact that army. And because you haven't had time to go back to that original army and really rethinking, well, how has this changed them now, that you throw it out, which is, I think, because there was a lot of emphasis on enforcers initially. They were one of the first factions we looked at, and therefore we'd looked at them and then kind of gone back to doing some of the special rules, then kind of carried on with some of the other armies. But with the other armies, we had in mind the changes we'd already made with the core rules. So again, they don't necessarily need anything major, but it's just to bring them up a little bit again.
So we've been mentioning the enforcers quite a bit throughout this. I guess we'd be expecting enforcers to be some of the prime recipients from alignment protocols?
That was the plan. They were originally going to be the one that had the most changes, and everything else was just going to be 1, 2. But then you look through things and you think, well, actually, no, now's the time. And Clive was very good about this. He said, no, do what you need to do. Do what will make the game balanced and work. So yeah, I think enforcers will get what they needed and everything else will get looked at.
So the Nova Structure Peacekeepers should see significant improvements. They were not necessarily the most compelling support choice in the list. And I think now where we've got them, they are looking at both a bit of a range increase on the thermal rifles and a points decrease overall as well for the unit, so that they are a bit more interesting. And the Demanter has also lost slow reload, so you'll be able to move and shoot with it. And especially for something which otherwise was at best effectively an interdiction zone more than anything else, where no one would go near, at least now it can actually go and do its job of hunting down tanks rather than just sort of sitting in one spot. So those guys have both seen a big change.
You talk about things like codex creep in other of the games, where each codex that comes out, each army that's released is better than the last one. And I think a lot of people sort of see that as that's because you're trying to push the latest game. But sometimes it's just that amazing benefit of hindsight of when we did the Night Stalkers, it wasn't that we were better at writing Night Stalkers than the people were when they wrote those original lists that we inherited. Of course we're not. They were brilliant Rules Committee members. We just had the benefit of hindsight of seeing what had happened and what had gone wrong. And then we could take those new things. So we had situations like before designations were introduced, actually by Elliot, in an attempt to make the companion work as a way of making Maison Labs, lab units and Blackwing units work in the companion. Before we had that tool, we didn't use it. Perhaps in retrospect, we would have used that concept with Pathfinders and with operatives or whatever. But by the time we came to Night Stalkers, we already had that tool. It was there ready to go. And we were able to say, okay, we'll make Hunter units that the Dream Hunter can work on, that kind of thing. It was just something else we had. And like Richard said, because enforcers had been looked at so heavily, they were one of the first, before those guys joined, and even before I joined the Rules Committee, they had been one of the first ones that had been looked at in a lot of detail. They are now almost like the oldest faction and the one that needs the most going back over. Ironically, Asterians had a little bit of an update before this as well. And obviously now they're a very large faction with a very large number of tools in their toolbox, but they've got some quite new and recent things.
We were commenting on that in our last episode. They're almost twice the size of some of the other factions, because half the faction is a Matsudan army nestled inside there. And I know I can't be asking for spoilers of whether we'd be expecting Matsudan to get their own faction, but I'm gonna. Should we be expecting Matsudan to get their own faction?
I don't know. I honestly don't know whether that is going to definitely be a thing, but we're not daft. We've spoken to Clive about it. You look at it and you go, Matsudan are fast approaching the point where they could be. So if that's something that Mantic want to do, I don't think it'd be a terrible idea, and I don't think it would be a massive leap for them to do. Obviously, if you just took pure Matsudan units, and that's including certain marionette units, which in lore they take, you're still lacking a few things like certain vehicles and certain heavy support things, stuff like that. So this is entirely down to if that's the direction that Mantic wants to go and they can find a way of filling those gaps, then I think that would make for a very interesting new list. If and when that will happen, I cannot at this moment honestly say, because I don't know.
I just find that a little interesting because you said we've got some vehicles, for instance, that are crossover between 4 factions actually at the moment. So some vehicles obviously could still work. I mean, the last thing I want to see is more Asterians on this table, especially if the Sans piloting them. But then again, I do like the look of some of the way the Matsudans design their vehicles, the jet bikes, etc., which is they're quite cool. So it'd be interesting to see how that space works out.
Well, you say Matsudan could use vehicles from Asterians, and it's true, but it's kind of one of the things that had to be thought about when Maison was coming out of the GCPS list is if you share too many units, you start to lose a reason for taking the original one. So if Maison Labs took every single GCPS unit, because there's no reason why Maison Labs couldn't get hold of heavy weapons teams and things like that. You get to a point of, why would you take the GCPS if Maison are just GCPS plus? And I think we'd have to do that there. You would need to get to a point where you didn't just have all the stuff that's good about Asterians in the Matsudan list, because then nobody would take the Asterian list. So there are some things that you have to leave behind intentionally, even if you could lore justify doing it. So yeah, you could put most of those Asterian vehicles into a Matsudan list, but wouldn't it be cooler if they could do some sort of heavy support things that were more Matsudan flavoured, and then the things that link the two lists together are still there? Because we'll have something to cross a couple of lists, because you do that thing where you started an army and before you know it, you started another army. You didn't mean to do it. How many people have started off Maison and ended up buying a GCPS army because it was already there. We want that, but we just don't want there to be like a clear, this one is just this with more stuff.
One of the things we've looked at changing is trying to improve the artillery tanks a bit. So they've generally seen a bit of a cost reduction across the board for starters, and in some cases a slight increase in range in a few cases. But the general idea was that we were perhaps a bit overly cautious with them when they were introduced, and we're sort of at the point where they really were not competitive at all for the slots they were sitting in. They're not going to be at a point where you look at them and go, I'm just going to take 3 of them. But hopefully they might see a bit of play on the table and people might be a bit more interested giving them a chance.
It's great to hear we're getting some love for the mortar and the artillery tanks. And we've said the Hornet is in need of some love. Are you able to give us any sort of indication what people should be expecting and why they might want to be taking a Hornet in the future?
Kind of the biggest problem with the Hornet was that the only units that it wasn't a complete death trap to be flying around in the Hornet generally were units with scouts, because say, for example, with GCPS, it was the Rangers. So this was a bit of a problem because the Rangers don't want to be in a Hornet. You might want to stick a unit of Marines and they're all vets even, but you don't, because if the Hornet goes down, everyone else is dead. And also it uses the entire movement for them to get out. And that made it pretty pointless because you could actually almost get there on foot quicker at that point than wasting the entire turn getting out of the transport. So the main thing we've looked at trying to address this, at the moment, we're looking at, say, the ability to have a drop line. If you're being transported, you can count as having anti-grav when disembarking during your activation. It does mean that if you get shot out the sky, you're all dead still. But think of it a bit like the bit out of Live, Die, Repeat, where they're all kind of dropping down with their sort of power suits and so forth from the big drop ships. It's a bit like that, the idea that they're just basically dropping down on ropes straight out and just going off immediately. They're also getting a little bit faster so that the mule isn't as fast as an aircraft as well. Not a massive speed boost for them, but just a little bit, just to make them feel a little bit more sensible in the grand scheme of things as well.
And just for anyone confused, Live, Die, Repeat was renamed to Edge of Tomorrow. So that's that's the film.
It's a unit that's been in discussion since before I was in the Rules Committee, I think. We were talking about it at the time when I started. And it's part of a bigger discussion about how flying things work. And you probably notice if you look into things like the Night Stalkers list with a big flying looking creature that we sidestepped using fly rules until we work out exactly what the ideal way of doing that is. So at the moment, it's rules to allow us to make those things work without doing big changes to how flying in general works, because the knock-on effects for that are massive.
I can also understand being cautious with something like a flying transport that transports 12 people, because were it opened up to the same sort of extent as just conventional transports, being able to drop a 10-strong unit of crushers with 2 hounds and then being able to charge in, I think would be game-changing for that particular game. So I can also understand caution around flying transports when they are fast and have big capacities. But it's great because obviously, as we've been saying, it feels a little like it's swung the other way and they're just not terribly useful at all. It'll be great if we're able to land that right in the sweet spot of them being worth taking, but not fundamentally game altering.
Well, this is fundamentally why we didn't give them anti-grav and kept them flying at the moment, because if it was anti-grav, you'd be able to bomb up the board like you do in a mule and then charge out of it. And so being able to drop, so you can still make it, you don't have to just stay there, you can make an advance and shoot even. It makes them a little bit more interesting to use. There are use cases with an anti-grav unit, you can't charge out of it, but you can advance and shoot and so forth. And so, we just wanted to get to the point where hopefully it has utility, because as it stands at the moment, there isn't really any faction with access to Hornet that they actually want to put in it fundamentally. And that's something we're hoping to get to the point where you might give it a try, because I think it is now a lot more viable with just a couple of small changes than it was previously.
I mean, I'm seeing uses with a new version where a 10-strong unit of GCPS veterans with grenade launchers being able to fly up the Hornet, can use its pintle mounts, and then they drop out and launch in with their carbines and grenade launchers. It's exactly the right size for getting a strong, potent unit up the board that shoots rather than assaults.
But yeah, that's the general idea with that. It was that sort of thing. One thing we've learned from some of the other APCs, more heavily armored ones, is that there's generally not a lot of enthusiasm for a slow, chunky transport as well. People generally like their transports to get a bit of a shift on and get things where they need to be. This one has a degree of risk and reward, of course, because if it gets shot down and you don't have anti-grav units inside it, they are all going to die. But you do have the reward of getting a unit up the board pretty quickly. And again, especially if you've been incident with an advance, being able to hopefully put down some suppressive fire as well if you've taken the side sponsons and so forth as well with them.
I think it's an example of one of those things where logic pushes you in a certain direction. Like you look at something and you'll say, well, a transport's got to be faster than walking because logically it is. And this transport's got to be faster than that dwarf transport because it's a dwarf thing and it should be reasonably slow. And now this aircraft's got to be faster than that. And then suddenly you realise that if you just keep on going down that logical line, you end up with something ridiculously fast on a board that's only 4 foot wide. And then you have to find ways of bringing things back in, because if you just keep on pushing to the next logical, you run out of room in the game. And I mean design room, not just physical inches on the tables.
Although you do get that as well.
Yeah, you get that as well. Yeah. There's quite a few things where we would sort of say, we want to put a unit in here, but it can't be better than that and it can't be worse than that, or that kind of thing. It was part of the problem when the Wolverine was brought in, where you looked at it and you said, the Wolverine has got to be a better tank than a Bronco, because it's a tank, but it's got to be a worse tank than a Forgefather Stonehammer, because that's a Forgefather thing. So you kind of look at that gap and you go, well, there's a little bit of world to live in here. How can I fit something in here and still leave room for if one day I wanted better GCPS tank that might, if that ever turned up.
Lancer!
Cross our fingers. You want to leave enough space so that something like that could still come above a Wolverine, but below Forgefather tank, because law-wise, that's where you're pegged. And there's only so many things you can roll on a D8. There's only so many keywords you can use, and there's only so many inches you can give somebody in movement. The Hornet ends up at that top end of the, yes, it should be exceedingly fast. But if it's exceedingly fast and it also does everything that the mule does, we're back into the realms of turn one backfield charges by very, very powerful things, and you lose your ability to react. And no one likes a game where even if they win, they felt that they didn't have agency through most of it.
All I'm hearing is that the mule's too fast and it needs to be reduced in speed. That's all I'm hearing.
But then I'd have to drop the speed of the Drakkar, and then the thing would be
it's already half the speed. The Drakkar's already half the speed of a mule.
Yeah, fair enough.
What I was taking from it is, regardless of what we think the unit should be, the game has to come first. We need to make sure that no matter what logically the unit we feel should be given, prioritizing game experience is more important.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can end up in a really weird space really, really quickly.
So this is what Kyle had to say on the Hornet, which does appear to be repeating a little bit of what we were going through. We have spent a lot of time on this, probably close to a year of active discussion and ideas that doesn't include the passing conversations about the Hornet before either. It has been a tricky thing to balance with the changes on to how command units in transports work. The thing the Hornet was most used for, boosting inspiring range and aura sizes while keeping command units safe, went away. And it didn't have another role it filled well that wasn't already taken by something better and or cheaper. On the other end, it's easy for tough flying units like the Hornet to get a bit too good with some of the changes, and it can dominate the game. I think changes that we've made with the addition of some of the Vault units has given the Hornet a role to fill what it does best.
Well, I think that probably comes to the end of our discussion of what we're going to be expecting from alignment protocols. To close us out, normally we'd be doing a Overwatch where we talk about what's coming on the Firefight horizon, but we've kind of spent the entire episode talking about what things we might be seeing on the Firefight horizon. So to close us out, of everything you've worked on as a member of the Firefight RC, what is your favorite and why?
When we were playing around with some of the rules changes for command protocols, the bit that I'm probably happiest that got in was the suggestion of devastating weapons. So you didn't end up just a case where heavy weapons were just better than everything else. That was probably one of my favorite little tweak changes, just to kind of feel that it wasn't just a no-brainer to take a Polaris cannon or something like that, because it was just better against everything. And so that's probably been the bit I've enjoyed most, was actually just some of the rules tweaks, just to try and improve the overall quality of life of the game. The other one, of course, being making sure that you could only use command orders once per turn, and actually having a bit more variety with them as well. You know, the dark days of just spamming Firestorm were over at that point, thankfully.
I actually think calling out Devastating from episode 1 of Controlled Fire, I think I called out Devastating as my number one change from Command Protocols. There weren't guns better at certain things, there were just better guns, and Devastating changed that up. So excellent.
I think I've enjoyed working on the Night Stalkers. Everything we'd done before Night Stalkers was very heavily somebody else's. I mean, Night Stalkers was started by Clive. You know, we've got to acknowledge that. Clive wrote the original list and he gave us that to work on. But everything else we worked on had already been out in the wild. It had already been done. Night Stalkers was the first time where nobody had seen it yet, and we were able to just go, what can we do with this? We can change anything. We can do all these things with it. We can add things in. It was a time where we could go to Mantic and they'd say, you know, are there any bits that you would like to add to this? And we're like, oh, it would be really useful if we had this, if we had this, we have this. It felt like the most creative time where it wasn't just us taking other people's creations and doing little tweaks, and we could actually put quite a lot of our own thoughts and things into. And it's made a list which I really quite enjoy playing and looking at and going, you know, I'm proud of that. We did well there.
Yeah, so the Night Stalkers was actually my first experience with beta testing as well. I came in with the call out for beta testers when they were dropping. And like I just said before in this podcast episode, I think just from out of the gate, very balanced and unique. I'm glad people are seeing the uniqueness of the list now, because back when they were coming out, a lot of people were saying, how are they not just Plague? But I obviously, having beta tested it, could sort of see and feel how that was going to be. And I'm glad that they've got their own identity. I think you all did a fantastic job on that.
I think one thing that really helped with them was actually just the amount of time we had without any sort of big time pressure in terms of really getting a good think about it. Some units had loads of discussion in coming to a final position on it. And I think that really helped come up with something that was both unique and relatively balanced, because we just had that time to play around with ideas and we didn't have to rush it. And that was really nice, just having that bit of extra time to run through that process.
And we had every archetype and every idea that had been thought of for all the previous factions to apply to it. And it was written from very scratch. It knew all of the command protocol rule changes. So when its commands were written, it was written specifically knowing they would only be used once. The transports were written specifically knowing how transport rules were work. Obviously, everything else was changed with those things in process, but there's something to be said for doing something that is fresh with all the advantages of hindsight.
Kyle also calls out Night Stalkers as his favorite thing to have been working on. So he says that he really enjoys working on the Night Stalkers with Matt and Richard, being able to create a whole new faction for the game while also getting to know both of them, as his first RC project was a fun experience. As a long-time wargamer, it was a bit surreal to be in the driver's seat for a new faction, but also a bit nerve-wracking. Matt and Richard were both very welcoming and open to his ideas, and he fondly remembers that first phone call that lasted over 3 hours, discussing the first iteration of the Night Stalker list. A lot of love for the Night Stalkers as an RC project. Well, that brings us to the end of our first birthday episode of Controlled Fire. So until next time, align your protocols, start priming your hornets, and unleash Controlled Fire.
Hear the